this topic, a U.S. shortage of artillery rounds, and specifically in relation to what the U.S. has been sending Ukraine to wage this proxy war against Russia. And I want to get into a little bit more detail in regards to that. So we were talking about this article from the Business Insider. The U.S. has given Ukraine nearly 1 million 155 millimeter artillery shells. Now it's looking for U.S. companies to build more of them. And it wasn't a million, it was 800,000. And when you're trying to calculate for how many rounds Ukraine has available per month and per day, 200,000 makes a difference. The article says, with U.S. ammunition stockpiles being depleted by deliveries to Ukraine, the U.S. Army is looking for new manufacturers of 155 millimeter howitzer shells. The Army recently put out a market survey to identify U.S. and Canadian companies that can manufacture up to 12,000 M795 155 millimeter high explosive shells a month, 12,000 shells per month. The M795 is the standard shell for Army and Marine 155 millimeter howitzers and would be the prime ammunition for any U.S. designed 155 millimeter howitzers sent to Ukraine, which is already using M777 towed 155 millimeter guns sent by the U.S. and Canada. The U.S. had sent 126 M777 cannons and more than 800,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition to Ukraine as of early September. Now the Pentagon fears that American ammunition stocks are reaching dangerously low levels, the Wall Street Journal reported, citing a defense official. The article goes on and says, among the requirements for manufacturers is demonstrating existing production capacity, projected monthly production and delivery capability of 12,000 projectiles per month, maximum monthly production capacity, and if they have made this item or similar items in the past, the Army survey said. And the article concludes by saying, the U.S. isn't the only one with an ammunition problem. Canada has shipped 155 millimeter shells to Ukraine and is now asking South Korea to replenish its stocks. So first of all, a lot of people are going to ask, how do you know that this is true? How do you know the U.S. really has an ammunition shortage? And how do you know that Ukraine isn't getting more than what the U.S. is saying? Well, it's very clear by looking at the results on the battlefield that Ukraine is most certainly outgunned in terms of technology and outgunned in terms of raw firepower. Russia just has more. We saw this demonstrated in practical terms during Ukraine's Kherson offensive. This was an offensive launched by Ukraine towards Russian positions around Kherson, and even according to the Washington Post, Ukraine was outfought on every single level, including being outgunned and not having enough ammunition to do what it needed to do for that offensive to have been successful. And so it failed. So this is kind of how we know that Ukraine is not getting enough guns and most certainly is not getting enough ammunition to fire out of these guns. Now, the article talks about Ukraine firing somewhere around 6,000 rounds per day. Well, 12,000 rounds per month. If the U.S. Army hired just one contractor producing 12,000 rounds per month, 12,000 rounds per month is only 400 rounds per day. That's far short of 6,000 that Ukraine currently fires. In order for the U.S. to be able to produce just enough to supply Ukraine's daily needs, they would have to find 15 of these contractors, or a contractor able to multiply output by 15 times, 12,000 per month, in order to just sustain Ukraine's firing rate, let alone surpass it or build up a stockpile for future conflict. The article points out that they don't know how many shells per month or per year the U.S. is actually trying to produce. They're just saying they're putting out this survey to see which companies can produce around 12,000 a month, or at least 12,000 per month. The idea is that the U.S. would probably hire multiple contractors to bring the number up much higher than 12,000 a month. I mean, they would have to, just to sustain Ukraine's current firing rates. What about Russia? Is Russia having this same problem? They're firing much more per day than Ukraine. They outgun them in terms of number of guns and in terms of the amount of ammunition these guns are firing on the battlefield. Well, here is a source that I found talking about production numbers, which is very difficult to find. It's The Insider. If you read The Insider, if you just look at the front homepage, or you look at the wording in these articles, it's obvious rampant anti-Russian propaganda. It is for sure spinning everything to portray Russia in the absolute worst light possible. So keep that in mind when I read to you what this article titled "A Farewell to Arms. By year end, Russia will be left almost without shells, artillery, and armored vehicles." And we've been hearing this from everybody. It is September now, so we're getting pretty close to the end here. It says, for Russia, and this was written late August, by the way, for Russia, 6 months of war have led not only to colossal, irreplaceable losses in manpower, but also to a huge waste of weapons and military equipment. Guided missiles are already very scarce. Shells for artillery and armored vehicles will be exhausted by the end of the year. And the state of military aviation precludes a full-scale air campaign. Because of the sanctions, Russia cannot continue full industrial production of weapons and replenish its arms stockpiles, which are rapidly running out. And then it goes on to produce absolutely no evidence at all to substantiate any of these claims. And of course, colossal, irreplaceable losses of manpower. We keep hearing these numbers cited by Ukrainian general staff and then repeated by the U.S. Department of Defense and across the entire Western media, but we're not seeing any breakdown as to how this number is arrived at, and we see no evidence of this on the battlefield. We don't see this happening. Also, the nature of the fighting is long-range warfare, and if Russia outguns and outranges Ukraine, how are they suffering these huge losses? How is Ukraine physically killing enough Russians to produce these losses we keep hearing about? There's no logical explanation provided anywhere. It talks specifically about artillery shell production, and it says it's worth trying to estimate the rate of Russian artillery shell production, given the fact that it was relatively small in the 1990s and 2000s and was at its peak in the 2010s, but then it never talks about beyond that period of time. It gives absolutely no numbers, say 2020, 2021, 2022. What are the production rates? Even late 2010s, it doesn't give us the production rates. It goes on and it says, however, even that rate of production of existing projectiles, as well as the rate of developing and creating new ammunition, did not seem to suit the Ministry of Defense. Therefore, in 2014, a large-scale program was launched to restore shells that had survived in artillery and missile arsenals. By the end of 2017, this program restored 1.7 million munitions and missiles of all types. That is about 570,000 per year. It was particularly emphasized that their production from scratch would have cost the budget 117 billion rubles, or 39 billion rubles per year. It goes on and it says, based on these figures, it's possible to estimate the volume of artillery ammunition production itself. We look at the earnings of the corresponding industrial enterprises and conglomerates, we will see that during those years, they ranged between 80 to 100 billion rubles. The earnings, of course, also include civilian products, which in some enterprises account for 25 to 30% of total revenue. As a consequence, the ratio between recovered and newly produced munitions can be estimated, albeit roughly, as 1 to 2, or for each 570,000 shells restored, there are up to 1.14 million new ones. Thus, the total annual rate of replenishment of artillery arsenals in the 2010s did not exceed 1.6 to 1.7 million shells of all types. And again, it never talks about after that period of time and gives no recent figures in regards to Russian artillery production. It either doesn't know them or it doesn't want to talk about them because it doesn't suit their narrative. Now, 1.6 to 1.7 million shells of all all types annually, works out to about 4,300 to 6,400 rounds per day. If that was the rate Russia was producing artillery rounds now, that would afford them 4,300 to 6,400 per day. At 6,400, that's around what Ukraine claims it is firing every day on the battlefield. In addition to Russia's own artillery production, and to be honest, this article from The Insider does not really shed any certain light on Russian artillery shell production. It really doesn't. We have articles like this from the New York Times. So in addition to production, this is another claim the U.S. is making. Russia is buying North Korean artillery, according to U.S. intelligence. And I already talked about this in a recent update. Russia is buying millions with an S, millions of artillery shells and rockets from North Korea, according to newly declassified American intelligence, a sign that global sanctions have severely restricted its supply chains and forced Moscow to turn to pariah states for military supplies. Well, they talk about these global sanctions. Not really. It's their Western sanctions. The West is not the entire world. Now, the New York Times uses this word millions with an S, so we could assume that they mean at least 2 million shells are being bought from North Korea. 2 million shells at 6,000 rounds per day. That's almost an entire year's worth. Compare that to the 800,000 rounds the U.S. sent Ukraine, which only accounts for about 4 or 5 months firing artillery at a rate of 6,000 rounds per day. So again, absolutely lopsided. You could claim that this is an act of desperation on Russia's part, but the aid that they're receiving is much more significant, if the story is even true, than the aid Ukraine is receiving from the United States. There's one more article I want to go over. Again, this is another one that I've covered in the past, but I think it fits in very well explaining all of this. This is from the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies. It's titled The Return of Industrial Warfare. And it says, the war in Ukraine has proven that the age of industrial warfare is still here. The massive consumption of equipment, vehicles, and ammunition requires a large-scale industrial base for resupply. Quantity still has a quality of its own. It talks about U.S. artillery round production. Presently, the United States is decreasing its artillery ammunition stockpiles. In 2020, artillery ammunition purchases decreased by 36% to $425 million. In 2022, the plan is to reduce expenditure on 155 millimeter artillery rounds to $174 million. This is equivalent to 75,357 M795 basic dumb rounds for regular artillery, 1,400 XM1113 rounds for the M777, and 1,046 XM1113 rounds for extended round artillery cannons. And again, these are tiny, tiny numbers when you break it down daily. What Ukraine is using, or at least claims it's using on the battlefield, 6,000 rounds per day. Doesn't even come close to adequate. The Russi article concludes, the war in Ukraine demonstrates that war between peer or near-peer adversaries demands the existence of a technically advanced mass-scale industrial age production capability. The Russian onslaught consumes ammunition at rates that massively exceed U.S. forecasts in ammunition production. For the United States to act as the arsenal of democracy in defense of Ukraine, there must be a major look at the manner and the scale at which the U.S. organizes its industrial base. This situation is especially critical because behind the Russian invasion stands the world's manufacturing capital, China. As the U.S. begins to expend more and more of its stockpiles to keep Ukraine in the war, China has yet to provide any meaningful military assistance to Russia. The West must assume that China will not allow Russia to be defeated, especially due to a lack of ammunition. If competition between autocracies and democracies has really entered a military phase, then the arsenal of democracy must first radically improve its approach to the production of materiel in wartime. So this is not me imagining that the US and its allies are at some sort of disadvantage in terms of military industrial capacity. It's not me imagining that they are incapable of sending Ukraine the aid it needs to stay in this fight. It's not me imagining this. It's Western sources admitting this. And it's one thing for Russia to admit that there is this shortfall in production and it needs to be rectified. It needs to be looked at. It's another thing to actually rectify it. And when you're talking about expanding production at a factory or building new factories to expand overall production, you're talking about things that can take months, if not years, to do. And the impact of this inability to support Ukraine logistically, to sustain it in terms of providing enough ammunition, this is going to manifest itself on the battlefield. It already has, but it will continue to manifest itself on the battlefield. The Russia article talks about China eventually possibly providing Russia aid. Imagine if it did, but even before that, what if Russia is actually buying millions of artillery rounds from North Korea? This is all something to think about for decision makers in the West who are thinking about escalating this or even continuing this. It's also something for people to think about who are overly optimistic about what just happened at Kharkov. You had this limited success. Is this something that is sustainable, or was this an all or nothing gamble that cannot be followed up, specifically because the US is unable to supply Ukraine what it needs to do so? All things to think about. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free.